Unitary system was basically a government where there was one government that basically called all the shots for the entire country. So if you remember, we talked about this within the context of France. France had one government, and do you remember what the education minister in France had said? Go ahead.
That they would teach like the same subject, like in the same context in like one part of the country, the same as like another part of the country.
You remember what subject it was that they had mentioned?
Foreign language.
Foreign language it was Latin. He said he could look at his watch and look at his calendar and he would know exactly, or she would know exactly which verb was being conjugated everywhere in the country because they had one government that set the policies for everybody and that's what they followed. Federal system was the United States. And if you remember, the federal system is the idea that you're going to have different governments that rule over you at the same time. So you might have a city government, a county government, a state government, a federal government. And some of these quotes that I had given you basically break down like some of the differences between what a federal government does and what a state government does. I also gave you the quote, laboratories of democracy. What's nice is that you can experiment in a federal system. So Wyoming was the first state that gave women the right to vote. Makes pretty good sense. Of course, that became a national policy. Not all policies that states try become national policies, but they're free to be able to experiment in certain areas. And if it works, then of course we all get it. If it doesn't work, we all don't suffer because that one policy did not work, kind of a thing. Do y'all remember the difference between these single member districts and proportional representation districts? Because this is kind of a big deal. Go ahead, Dennis.
So that was where you elect one candidate, like to represent everyone
Okay.
from a party, and then
To be a reflection of the voters.
And which one? Is that single member or proportional?
that
Proportional.
single member.
Yeah, in the United States, in a single member district, it would be Dennis versus Jermaine. And in that particular election, one of you, even if you don't get a majority, let's say it's you versus Malika back there. If there's three people running, the person that gets the most votes wins. And you may not happen to get a majority. If you win without a majority, that's actually called a plurality. So you can win without a majority of the vote. But the idea is that in the United States, we basically have the Democrats and the Republicans, and they swallow up all of the other challengers. So we really only have two parties here. Because if you vote for a third party, your vote basically gets wasted. The person that gets the most votes wins. And do you remember what I said that was kind of squirrely? If you got 47%, Dennis, if Jermaine, you got 41%, and if Malika, you got that other, 10, 12%, whatever it is, what are we basically saying about that election? What's the problem?
53% of people aren't represented.
You won with 47%. If you add up Malika and Jermaine's totals, then in fact 53% of the people voted do not technically have a voice in government. A majority of the people that voted don't really get a say. And the argument is that you waste a lot of votes in a plurality or a single member system that way.
Can you repeat what you said a plurality was?
Plurality is the idea that you can win without a majority of the votes.
Okay.
You have the most votes, but it doesn't necessarily add up to being over 50%. And that happens a lot in the United States in presidential elections, more than you would think. How does a proportional system differ? Yeah, go ahead, Jermaine.
It basically takes like whoever has like more than like 5% gets represented.
That's right. And in the election that was the single member one, we had said that people vote for the candidates. So Dennis's name is on there, Jermaine, your name was on there, Malika's name was on there. In a proportional system, are you voting for people? Anybody? What are you voting for? You're voting for the party. So you're going to vote for the party, and as long as you get a minimum of 5% of the vote, which is the threshold, typically it's 5% of the vote, then you're going to be guaranteed seats in the legislature. You're going to be guaranteed seats proportionate to the percentage of the votes that you get. If you get 26% of the vote, you get 26% of the seats. You get 11% of the vote, you get 11% of the seats. If you get 3% of the vote, you didn't meet the threshold, you do not get any seats. But the trick on this is that, remember what Dennis said, in a single member district, when 53% of the people voted against Dennis, they get no voice in government. In a proportional system, as long as you get at least 5% of the vote, you're gonna get at least 5% of the seats. So you're gonna have more parties that are actually gonna get into office in a proportional system. So kind of keep that in mind. What's the problem? Go ahead.
I just have one, well, the votes that don't meet the 5% threshold, they get redistributed, right?
They get redistributed to everybody else.
Like just equally among the parties that.
I kind of proportionately, you know, so like if one of the other parties gets 40% and the other, maybe one of the other ones only gets 20, of course it's gonna make sense that the one that got 40 is gonna get twice as many of the redistribution as the one that got the 20, yeah. So it'll be kind of proportionate. What's the problem with proportional systems? Go ahead.
I just seen it's unstable.
What do you mean by unstable? Because you're right, but what is unstable about them?
I don't know.
Go ahead.
You got all these different parties trying to work together, and they all kind of have differing ideas, so it's kind of hard. It's unstable to like have all these not like-minded people work together, I guess.
Why do they have to work together? What do they need ultimately to get to rule?
Majority?
You need a majority. And remember, in the single member system, if you've got basically two parties, one of them is almost always going to be in the majority and one of them is going to be in the minority. Well, in a proportional system, because you get seats when you vote for these other parties, as long as you meet that threshold, that means that there's going to be more parties that are going to be in the government. It also means that more parties are going to have to kind of group together in order to get a majority. And maybe you're in the majority on one issue, but that majority could break apart and change on different issues. So it's very, very unstable. It is actually a wonderful reflection of the voters, but it is very, very unstable. So kind of keep that in mind.
Where do they have that?
Oh, that's in many of the places around the world. I mean, if you go to Europe, for example, you see a lot of these proportional representation
Would you say like
systems.
Turkey or like?
I don't want to get into Turkey because I'm not an expert there. But if you go to places like France, actually, if you go to a place like Germany, for example, Germany has got a mix that is single member and that's proportional.
Okay.
So the United States, as crazy as it sounds, we're supposed to be the democracy of
Right.
the world. We are in the minority with how we elect people. There are probably 100 countries in the world, if not more, that have a proportional system. So keep that in mind. I don't know that I mentioned that when we were in class. Last thing from this chapter, and I'll go fairly quick with this, because I do want to get into the ideology one. 2 questions. How much should government redistribute the economic wealth? And how much should the government regulate the economy? In this chapter, we're basically talking about different kinds of governments. And you could argue that, you know, there are effective and ineffective states, which we really didn't get into, so I'm not going to test you on that. You could argue that you can categorize a government based on how they elect people into office. And this last section is going to be, you can categorize a government based on how much or how little they regulate the economy versus how much or how little they redistribute within the economy. And if you remember up here, laissez-faire, welfare state, statism, and socialism, what is laissez-faire, literally?
Like whatever happens, happens.
What's that, Jermaine?
Let it be or something.
Let it be. To allow one to do, I think, is literally what it translates as. And in a laissez-faire kind of a system, the government is going to minimize its redistribution, and the government is going to minimize its regulation of the economy. The government that governs best governs least is kind of the mindset on this. And do you remember the article that I had given you as a wonderful example of laissez-faire? About the vacations. What is the United States policy, Ketsia, dealing with paid vacations? There is no mandatory paid vacation in the United States. And if you go back and you look at that article, it breaks down a lot of the social democracies in Europe. It breaks down, you know, Britain and France and places like this. Even China and Japan guarantee some form of paid vacation, but the United States government doesn't. And the idea behind laissez-faire is the government that governs best regarding the economy governs least. So the idea is that you want the government in the economy as little as possible. Environmental regulations, no. Paid vacations, no. Minimum wage, no. These kinds of things. in the United States, we like to think of the idea that we're laissez-faire, but we have minimum wage requirements. We have overtime requirements. We have that if you get injured on the job, in fact, your job is going to be responsible for that. We have laws out there that say that if you buy a product and it's a faulty product, I should say, then in fact, you're going to be able to get some compensation for this. So we're not pure laissez-faire. But in terms of the paid vacation, there is no guarantee of that in the United States. So take a good look at that article. And I believe it also mentions in there about how much productivity per hour the workers do in the different places. I think the United States was 4th or 5th in that article, but maybe take a good look at that number. What was welfare state?
The state owns little or no industry, but does redistribute up to the rest of the law.
The welfare state, and it's not welfare in the American context, but basically they're saying that you're going to provide, the government will provide, cradle to grave protection. They're going to provide child care. They're going to provide health insurance. They're going to provide, family leave after you have a baby oftentimes. They're going to provide university expenses. I mean, all of these wonderful things. Now, the trick on this, and if you remember, I've asked you this question several times. Can the government spend my money better than me? In a welfare state system, they're going to say yes. And typically, they're going to tax you half of your income, if not higher, because they're providing all of these services. Some people would say, I would rather have lower taxes and be able to spend my money more so that it caters to me, rather than have the government do it. Others would say, well, it's not like we have health insurance like they have in other places in the world. It's not like we have child care or university like they do in other places in the world. Maybe, in fact, the government should spend more, spend better, so that people have better opportunity. I'll leave that to y'all, but Europe is a good example of a lot of these welfare states. And the problem that happens sometimes is that the tax rates get really, really high. The benefits become very, very expensive, and ultimately they're just not able to continue to pay for them at the levels that they want. So keep that in mind. In a welfare system, they're going to not regulate business, but they're going to redistribute the money. Statism, and I've got Hitler up here. Do y'all remember any examples of statism from the articles? Go ahead.
Well, Nazism is a form of statism, isn't it?
What did Hitler say that made it very, very statist?
The state, should come before anything.
You should provide for the state.
What's that?
You should provide for the state.
The argument was, as long as you were adding to the state, then in fact you should be allowed to be kept around. If you get to the point where you're dependent upon the state and you're not adding to it, then in fact you're weakening the state. And the argument basically behind the statist is that we want people that are going to carry the water rather than people that are going to drink it. Meaning you need to contribute, and if you're only taking and not contributing, then you really don't need to be here.
Right.
What were the articles that I had given y'all that dealt with statism in some level?
Assisted suicide.
There were several that dealt with assisted suicide. The one that I just added this morning was actually the one, if you remember, that was dealing with the married couple that had been married, 50, 60 years, and she had a terminal illness, he did not. But he did not want to live without her, so he decided that even though he was healthy, with the exception of old age, he would commit assisted suicide with her. She was doing it to put herself out of her misery of her illness. He was doing it to put himself out of his misery of having to live without her. Now, in this regard, the reason that this becomes statism is the idea that what would happen if, government could decide or basically put a value on life? What would happen if government allowed people to simply just decide that they wanted to take their own lives? I mean, you set a dangerous precedent there. And the dangerous precedent would be, does that mean that only healthy people should live? Does that mean that only productive people should live? Because people might be taken advantage of. And it mentions in there the younger people that could assume, I guess, ultimately the death benefits if an older person were to be talked into assisted suicide or ending their life early, being taken advantage of. Notice the death panel article. What was the death panel article? Go ahead.
Is that the one where there's a waiting list for some transplant or something, and that had a diverse panel?
Dialysis. Yeah, this was the first kidney dialysis, and they could only afford to provide dialysis to a limited number of people. If you remember in that article, what they were doing was they were running your blood through sausage casing in a saltwater drum in order to basically purify it and then put it back into you. And the people that got